The pretense is that the worker is there by choice and has agreed to obey, as opposed that he must be there in order to make a living. And if you pretend that, then it's not so bad. But if you actually look at reality and you look it in the face for what it is, then it's clear that it's an unequal, oppressive situation where autonomy of the worker is downgraded.
I think people have the capacities to see through the deceit in which they're ensnared, but they got to make the effort.
This is Propa-Ganada.
Thank you for tuning in to Propa-Ganada, where we firmly but politely challenge corporate power in Canada. Now, let's say you or I were just walking down the street and all of a sudden you decide to smack someone in the head and just punch them in the head and injure them. Well, the legal system would have some pretty serious consequences, right? Jail time, fine, and whatnot. However, if a corporation and those running corporations knowingly decide to take actions that result in the injuries or deaths of hundreds or thousands of people, think asbestos, by the way, there's hardly any consequences, maybe a little fine, but it doesn't scale up, So the legal system does not treat all equally, and corporations use the legal system to protect themselves from the damages they've caused. This book, Capitalism, A Crime Story, was written by Harry Glasbeek. Harry Glasbeek is a professor emeritus and senior scholar at the Osgoode Hall School of Law at York University. And I'm just going to read one of the quotes on the back of the book describing him by Jim Stanford. So, Harry Glasbeek has been a fearless, daunting crusader for the public interest in the face of corporate greed, corruption, and criminality. This powerful, readable book proves the problem does not originate with a few bad apples. It's programmed into the DNA of a system that privileges accumulation over human life. So without any further ado, I encourage you to sit back, relax, and hear the wisdom of Harry Glasbeek. I guess I wanted to start the conversation off just on a general question about the state of democracy in Canada.
Government it virtually controls none of the major decisions in our society. And people are not just voting people, of course, they go to work, they walk around in their environment, they buy things, they meet with each other, they have personal and hostile relationships and friendly relationships. And the question is, how democratic are all these communal sets of relationships in other communal relationships which they are? That is not considered at all by this system. And so there's that question. So that divides itself again into two. The great trick of a capitalist society, of modern capitalist society, is to divide the political from the economic. We pretend that the state sphere, where you vote, is the political sphere, and the rest of your life is economic. And and that separation is a false separation, of course. And now, in the economic sphere, therefore, there is no need for democracy. And so that, of course, is a major failure. And that comes from the inequality we have in our society. In a capitalist society, by definition, wealth is to be unequally divided. A few people control most of the wealth in a country like Canada. So we have unequal division. What does that mean? Well, it means that for most people, in order to provide for themselves, for their livelihoods, for their children, for their education, their housing, whatever, their clothing, their needs, they must find somewhere to sell, to invest the only thing they have, which is their labor capacity. And so therefore they depend on those very large wealth owners to invest their capital in order to start a situation where work needs to be performed. Now, that will only be done if a profit can be made by the investor. And so therefore you have a situation where there is an unequal relationship economically. Some people are begging for work and other people may or may not give it to them. So you start off with fantastic inequality. And you start off with that belief that that is a necessary way of doing things. And that means two important things for democracy. One, in the workplace, there is no democracy at all, right? And workers are always fighting together. That's what unionization is about.
They could be considered private tyrannies, right?
Small,
yeah.
Yes, absolutely. They're organized. In fact, the model from an industrial relations point of view, the model that was adopted by large employers as they developed through the late industrial revolution in the 19th century was the military model. And it's now softened with, we talk about human resource department and so on, but basically it's a military model. And it's evident in the one basic rule in every workplace, unionized or not, makes no difference. Public service, private entity, makes no difference. That rule is always the same. Every worker has a duty to obey the employer. so the whole idea of being autonomous disappears right before your eyes, unless you pretend. See, it is the pretense that we require. And there's the lack of democracy. The pretense is that the worker is there by choice and has agreed to obey, as opposed to that he must be there in order to make a living. And if you pretend that, then it's not so bad. But if you actually look at reality and you look it in the face for what it is, then it's clear that it's an unequal, oppressive situation where autonomy of the worker is downgraded. So you've undermined the supposed holy grail of the whole system in the economic sphere, and that is permitted. Now that works in that way at the workplace or in the environment. For instance, I didn't agree to have millions of particles in my ambient air, which are doing all sorts of things to my chest and my nose or whatever else with my skin. I've got no idea, and I didn't agree to them, but they're there. And and I get no choice in that. And that comes to the second thing. If I want to change them, I have to change the way that people invest their capital. We've got to stop them using fossil fuels, for instance, or lead, or whatever the issue is, or using water, which was once pure and polluting it. We've got to stop all that. How do we stop it? Well, we can only stop it through government, through that electoral system which is failing us. Now, who's the government going to listen to? A bunch of people who are not going to invest in anything, or people who say to them, if you take that away from us, we're going to take our investment and put it in, I don't know, Brazil or India, where somebody will leave us alone. And so again, the government bows down to capital, just as the worker bows down to capital. So what you have is a system of liberal democracy, which is based on a political notion of free individuals, when those individuals are not free anywhere outside that system. So the freedom that is given is a very, very minor and feeble one.
A lot of the biggest companies receive some form of subsidy from the federal government. When the idea of a regulation being imposed on the industry is put forth, companies threaten to move their operations to other countries. And I guess what I'm wondering to you is, in your perspective, when companies make this threat of going overseas when taking jobs elsewhere, at what point should we just either call their bluff, or two, then say, fine, go, and we will use our subsidies, our tax money, in ways that will actually invest back in the population?
Is the last point. I don't think I can answer at what point we do this, because there is a presumption that we can, and and that may not be based. The whole idea of capital, of course, is diminish cost and to heighten profit. You diminish cost by not paying for things, or using things that you get for free, like the environment.
Right.
And
externalizing, right?
Everything, right? As much as you can. And we have rules, we stop it from time to time, but it's a continuous battle, and we're always behind the eight ball because we want their capital invested. It is that starting position which makes the possibility of using our governmental powers very limited.
So we basically, our choices are limited to how we need to be able to bribe companies through, companies are sitting there waiting for our money. And I know this is something you wrote in one of your recent articles about how the pharmaceutical companies weren't going to do any
Right.
research unless prompted through taxpayers' money. Yeah.
No, that's absolutely right.
Yeah.
That's a good example.
Yeah.
That's a good example. In fact, for reasons which are ideological, we ran down whatever laboratories we had for research in Canada, leaving it to other countries to do it, and figuring that by whatever we needed when we needed it. That meant, of course, that we were not doing any decent research, although there was an attempt by the National Research Council, by the way, to do so, aided by a Chinese firm, and that fell down for reasons I don't know much about. But basically, we had no capacities to research and manufacture. So and therefore we had to rely on others. Now, if you have to rely on others, what do you do? Well, say when we needed personal property equipment, we didn't have any. Protection.
Personal property equipment.
Gowns and masks and gloves and all these things that people need.
It wasn't there. Yeah.
Sanitizer. It wasn't there. So we had to buy it on the market because we love markets. So we had to buy it on the market. That is from profiteers. Now, obviously, we could have said to our manufacturers, make them for us because that's cheaper and quicker. Right? And we did eventually. We started doing it, but we had to pay them big bucks because they wouldn't do it until they were certain of being able to make a profit. Mm-hmm. Now, this is the most significant thing that I'm trying to say. I think they don't care about our needs. Yeah. They only provide for profit. If our needs coincide with profit making, they'll provide for our needs, and that's the only way that we. Whereas a government, of course, is set to provide for our needs without making a profit. That's the huge difference between the two spheres. Pretending that these two spheres are separate, right, is what causes our democracy to fail.
Right. And so can we talk about taxation then? Am I right to suggest that with more tax money coming in, that realm of political power, of people power grows? Am I right to suggest that if we were to more progressively tax those billionaires, and again, I'm going to quickly throw in a statistic here that since the beginning of COVID, a recent study in the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives showed that the top 20 Canadian billionaires amassed $37 billion worth of wealth, while at least 1.1 million Canadians went jobless, and almost about 715,000 Canadians went to half-time hours. So even though we're told that we're all sharing this equally. So I'm wondering, is tax reform enough to get more power?
If you can exercise your taxation power to get more money out of capital, that is, you can increase the cost of doing business for them. See, there is no need for the private investor, in theory at least. I mean, why is it that if you and I work for an oil company and we know how to dig the oil out of the ground, and we want that oil out of the ground, well, why do we need Shell? Why can't the government fund you and I, and we take our
Crown
skills
Corporation,
and know-how, right, and do what we always did, except we now do it for the government.
Right.
Crown Corporation, a government department, all of these things are possible. What we have is an ideology which believes that the private creation of welfare by allowing people to chase profit is more efficient and better than using it through public means, that is, through the democratic political means. That belief is deep-seated.
So the logical progression of having democracy at the workplace is to have, I would say, cooperatives, right? And having a democratically run businesses. And what would you say to people who argue that you need to have this hierarchical structure of a CEO, a board of directors, in order for the efficiency, in order to be competitive in the global marketplace? What would you say to those type of people?
They always say, I wish they weren't here. Again, it's a scale, right? Mondragon is the best example we've had of a cooperative which works in the way that you described. We've had lots of failures as well, and the Argentinian ones were interesting, and there was a nice movie by Naomi Klein and R.V. Lewis about it, which is well worth
the take, yeah.
And but there are limits, right? And for instance, in Argentina, what they really were failing enterprises, right? And so you start off from a point of weakness.
Right.
Problem is, you're still surrounded overwhelmingly by the market. And that has two aspects. One aspect about which I do not know that much, but which is important, and one which is more obvious than the one that you raised. In order to make goods and supply services, as Mondragon does, you eventually have to go into the markets, which are not run that way, and they're much larger. So competition can become very fierce. And I think last year Mondragon announced that they had to close one of their divisions. They sold, I think, washing machines, I think it was, as I remember, to most of Europe, and they couldn't make it anymore because of the competition, mostly from Eastern Asia.
Yeah.
And and they just couldn't make it, and that meant, of course, that people were now jobless. Now, in their system, they provided for these people, and that is, of course, the strong thing about them. But that's because they're quite large and they're able to do it. But you can't do that forever, right? So that's one aspect. You're still in the major markets, and there are several examples of that. There's a Romano Emilio example as well in Italy, and there are other cooperatives throughout the world where relative success is obtained, and where what you say works somewhat. But eventually, you're not threatening the overall system. The other aspect of that is financialization. In order to operate in set up businesses, and or I won't call them businesses, productive firms of one kind or another, in order to produce goods and services for your own people, and perhaps for other people, so that you can make more for your own people, or an exchange and trade. If you have to do all that, you'll need finance.
Right. Capital. Yeah.
Finance is heavily concentrated, and financial capital is very, very careful about how it parcels out its money. So it would not give it to these people. So they squeeze them. For instance, Canada is a very good example where there have been many co-ops, and there's been some credit union banking, which are of that kind, but they've gradually been relegated to nothingness by fierce bank competition, supported by government, by the way, which supports 4 banks and nothing else. And all these things are signposts of what might be done. As to the question of whether workers can run, well, of course they can. I mean, you can't run it without workers. In the 60s and 70s, and there was a moment, a shiny moment, which was bigger than Mondragon in its impact, I think. It was in what then called Yugoslavia. And the Yugoslavian model was the closest thing we've had to an industrial democracy model. Again, not perfect. I mean, it's difficult, right, to overthrow capitalism. But what it did do, and in its own setting, it was the government which was the major decider. But what people would do, they would set up communities, and Venezuela has been a recent example of that, and that's why it came under so much fire, by the way. But in Yugoslavia, they didn't have such immediate opposition. And what they're able to do is communities would go forward and said, we want to set up a shoe factory, because we think we need a shoe factory here. And the government would decide whether it was appropriate that there should be a shoe factory. So it wasn't the people just themselves. So there are limits to this. But if the government decided that, it would provide the finance.
Yes.
That's the key. Then the people would decide for themselves how to run it, what to run it. And the whole model was that it would be workers run. Hospitals were run like that. They ran hospitals on the basis that everybody, including the patients, participated in decision making. Now, when you needed expertise, you required expertise, but everybody, and you rotated people. Some people were managers for 2 years and then became workers. Workers became managers for 2 years. And so that this whole thing about expertise and skills and so on, it's an argument, of course, you need expertise and skill. But after all, they're just people. Everybody can get expertise and skill. So that is not an impediment. It's an impediment in thinking, but not an impediment in truth. What is impediment is the unequal division of power, which stops us from getting a foothold into the system.
Yeah.
The recent, if I can go on for just 1 second.
Yeah, of course.
That the recent attempt by the Corbyn-led Labour Party
Yeah.
in England. The reason they had a statement out by the would-be treasurer was a man called MacDonald, and he put out a very powerful paper about how they would gradually change the nature of the economy, and the purpose to make the economy democratically run, which is the point where we began, right? That was all. So all utilities would be returned to government because they sold them all off, right? And so the things that people need, things that people could need, for instance, running of internet, would be decentralized as well and given to communities to happen. And
a public utility, right? Make it a public utility.
They made many more things, public services. Worker, in as much as private capital was to continue, of course, for a while, workers would get a right to get up to 10% of the equity, not just money, but they would actually get shares that they could vote. We haven't talked, by the way, about corporations, which of course are fundamentally anti-democratic. The whole idea of a corporation is to be anti-democratic. There is no other purpose.
Does revoking the corporate charter is that an effective way to go after these companies?
The removal of the charter is very much an American notion. That's grown up, and there's quite a good movement in the United States of people wanting to remove charters for corporations behaving irresponsibly, to show them that they're unacceptable, that they're not doing what they're designed to do. By the way, their history is a bit more complicated. Their initial history, of course, was to be colonizers. So for instance, I'll just name a few so you'll know the Russia Company, the Baltimore, the Pennsylvania Company, the Virginia Company. They were all companies before they became states. That's what they were. And the East India Company, and the Hudson Bay Company, and they were actually charters given by an empire somewhere. In this case, England, that we're talking about, but it could be France, Portugal, Spain, and they were given a charter by that country, not by any other country, and they were sent with ambassadors and troops to go and get other people's goods and people, and they were protected and they fought wars. Pirates were nearly always people who from the other empire, and they were not. Right. So anyhow, that's another story. That's a whole. But so the whole origin is of it. Going back to your question, the charter removal does one thing. It obviously is educational. It's a deterrent to corporate actors that they're going to be careful, otherwise they lose the advantages and privileges they have. But of course, it wouldn't prevent the same people from getting another charter. And I'm not sure how in the long run it's more than educational. What you want to get at, and you probably know, I've written for this unfortunately way too long a length. I think you want to get at the actual investors. I think you want to get at the people who, before you quoted me a figure about how many billionaires became even more billionaires like recently. But they're people, they're not corporations.
Yeah.
And and take it away from them, I say. And now they're the privileged ones.
Yeah.
And they because they don't have, for instance, let's take a very simple example. When Boeing had this defective design, which it knew about, by the way, and it sent planes out, and they've now paid a fine. They've agreed to pay $2.5 billion fine, for which the government will pay, by the way. But that's another side of the issue. But they buy it, and it looks very spectacular. But no shareholder has to give any money back. Well, they made money out of people falling out of the sky. No executive's got to give a bonus back. Same thing with the long-term care homes. People are making huge profits, and we say we'll teach them a lesson. But I haven't seen a single shareholder step up and say, "Look, this is terrible. I'm going to give my money back." And so we've got to understand, capitalists are flesh and blood. Corporations are an instrument. And right, and so merely to remove the instrument for a moment doesn't address the fundamental problem.
In a sense, it's one person cutting off the arm of another for money.
Yeah.
And it's totally fine. But if you or I were to do that, we'd be put in jail.
Well,
yeah,
clearly. And
no,
we should.
Yeah, yeah.
What I guess distresses me most is the fact that we live in Canada, in a relatively affluent part of the world, that we live in an affluent part of the world with very little control over our lives, and with a lot of misery all around us, even as we're affluent. And and we don't know what to do about it because we're fragmented. The most important thing is we're fragmented. Each of us faces different problems. And I don't mean that we all have the same problems, but one or two problems hit us in one way or another harder than it hits other people. And we're easily cut apart. So for instance, because we compete for jobs, just take an obvious example. Because we compete for jobs, a person who's in a difficult position to get a job will hate migrants being brought in, will hate women being given an opportunity, will hate children being given an opportunity to work, or old people who are supposedly have retired to work.
They accept the framework, they accept the structure.
Because they're in it. There is no way for them to. There's no way for them to participate and get what they want. It's very difficult to see beyond that. Mm-hmm. And so therefore, in order to justify what they know is a wrongful approach, they justify it by bad reasons. So it's fuel. Mm-hmm. It's not necessary to capitalism, but it's fuel that serves capitalism to be a racist. Because then you can say that person doesn't want, we shouldn't have that person here, or we shouldn't have that migrant here, or this asylum seeker should be sent back, or this nationality is no good, or this ethnic origin, or this religion, whatever it is that turns people on. People are turned on by all sorts of terrible things, and they know them to be terrible, I think. But it's a justificatory system to be able to participate at an effective level. So it divides us, even though the problem that they're facing is the same for all these people. But you can't see that in that setting. It's very hard. And because you're fighting, and because you're always fighting for a remedy, one of the difficulties is that the remedy doesn't come from the private capital. It comes from you ask your government. That's why we have democracy, by the way. That's why we have a universal franchise. Workers were so alienated and dispossessed by the advance of capitalism, especially during the 19th century, that they needed an alternative power to push back. They knew they had the numbers, so if they could control. And by the way, capital, just for your listening audience, if you have one, the capital pushed back originally. It's all in the books. Yeah. 19th century, they opposed the universal franchise because, and they actually said this in the parliament, if workers get to vote, and there's more of them than there is of us, they'll cut the number of hours they can work. Yeah. They'll apply taxes to us. Right.
They knew that. Yeah.
Then anyhow, we got there.
Yeah.
Then we go to government to give us services that we can't get from capital needs. For instance, again, your work, social work, is typical. Those are people in need of government help. So government becomes the enemy. So the target for all these well-meaning, well-intentioned, decent people is the government.
It's the face, right? It's the face of the
oppression. It's the activist. Yeah. It's the entity, the institution that can give you what you need immediately. Right? The source of the problem is the capitalist not paying tax, and and owning property that you can, and so on. But that you can't get to. So the difficulty then in answering the question is, how do you remedy that? And what it means is we've got to see the commonality of our problem. How that is to be done, I don't know. People talk in fancy ways that I don't like using, but they talk about a movement. right? Rather than working through the state, that you create a communal movement amongst people. Cooperatives are a basis for that, right? You talked about cooperatives, that people have joint interests. You stop separating work from your other life. For instance, we separate our work life now. Capitalism succeeded in this part of the world to make us consumers first. We go to work not to live. We go to work in order to consume, which is our life.
Right.
And so that's an upside down notion of a human being, but that's being created. And so the notion is to link people's problems. Now there are clear signs that this is becoming more possible right now. And the main reason is the failure of our environment. As our planet is being destroyed, people gradually are seeing the transcendence of that problem. I mean, it's a fundamental problem for everyone shares in that problem, and in one way or another. That's why you get little kids like Greta Thunberg standing up and everybody saying, yeah, she's right. It's as simple as that. Why are we pussyfooting around? And and that's very important. That raises the possibility, but it still leaves people in their silos. And they've got to come out of the silos and make sacrifices. So, for instance, if you want a better environment, you're going to have to ask workers to make sacrifices. You're going to have to say that you can't dig this, you can't dig tar oil out, the tar sands oil out, and lose your jobs. Well, you got to give them something. Everybody talks, oh, we'll give them something, but who's going to do that? Well, it has to be the state. Well, then you got to conquer the state, and you get into the same argument all over again, right? And so it's extreme. I wouldn't even pretend to have an answer for that question, but I can see the problem.
Are you hopeless, or do you?
No, I'm not hopeless. I think what makes, I try to be a socialist, and I think a socialist has to be an optimist about human beings. And you have to believe that human beings are better than we are treated as, and treat ourselves as. I do believe that there is such a thing as being humane as opposed to merely being human. So I'm optimistic in that sense. I'm pessimistic about many of our circumstances.
If you were to ask anyone listening to this to just change one small way that they looked at the world around them, or one small way they could change their behaviors, that would provide a more fertile ground for a more social leaning future, what would be one? It doesn't have to be the one, just one way that you would wish people to change.
I guess that if I have my radars, the first thing I would do is tell people to get rid of charity and demand sharing. Sharing. Now, it's a bit flabby, I know, but that's what I would say.
So in the sense that rather than charity being a way to you give a little bit to feel better about yourself, it's just the mentality that this is what we do as a people. The mentality,
yes, that Einstein once said. I want to quote myself. Einstein once said, he doesn't know why he's in the world. He's got no way of knowing why he's in the world, but he knows one thing: I'm here to serve other people, and I think that's the thing we should live by.